I welcome our panelists to just grab any question you see and that you would like to answer and start answering. The first one is, does anyone know if we're testing for parasites or other dangerous toxins, bacteria, viruses, heavy metals, etc.?
Yeah, I guess I'll take that. So this is Mike Parsons, for those who can't see me, I guess. But there are different methods for controlling cyanobacteria that people are looking at. I mentioned before with Dr. Urakawa looking at hydrogen peroxide, but there are some chemical methods using, for example, ozone and using oxygen radicals that are looking at other bacteria. Bacteria would outcompete the cyanobacteria, the nutrients. I don't know of anybody who's looking at pathogens, cyanobacteria. I know there's some interest in that with red tide, but there is also some interest in predators in terms of the grazers of the cyanobacteria. So one thing that's interesting when you look at some of the seaweed growth that we're seeing, and possibly with some of the algal blooms, there could be this top-down control where the grazers are not present and or not as effective in biomass, and that allows the biomass to build up. So that is an area that needs more study for sure.
I'll take the YRC Maps enforceable question. Technically, basic management action plans, they're adopted by secretarial order, and that does mean that they should be enforceable. So I think maybe the question is, at what point through the process do we look at whether the BMAPs are achieving the goals that they were set out to do? And yeah. Rayanne, if you had anything else. What percentage?
You can answer one of those, Mike. BMAA.
All right, we're just welcoming the panelists. If you see questions up there, I see there's one specifically for Marissa. And so if there's any of these that you feel comfortable answering, just feel free to answer them as you see them.
Yeah, so maybe I'll combine the BMAA and cyanobacteria toxins. There are ongoing studies. John Cassani is actually leading a group to look more at the airborne toxins, BMAA and the microcystin. So that works forward. As always, when you're doing these research projects, it's a slow process trying to arrange the funding so you can actually collect the samples, do the toxin analyses, get in the field, so on and so forth. But those are slowly moving forward. And I think, especially coming into the wet season and the summer, we need to be really prepared to collect the data needed there. And once again, BMAA, toxicity needs further studying on exactly what it's doing and how toxic it is, what kind of exposure there in terms of the risk assessment. And there are other compounds, other cyanotoxins. We're not really seeing them in the system right now, but none of them, to my knowledge, really affect the endocrine system. So I would say that's not something we're looking at right now.
Right.
I'm not sure if I have a complete answer for the one that's addressed to me, but the question is, what percentage of total nitrogen load to the Sebastian River estuary could the C43 reservoir remove in a best case scenario? It's really going to depend on the load that's going in the reservoir and the types of removal practices that are put in place through this C43 reservoir water quality component development process. So we're going to have to look at how this process develops and look for the most effective solutions for this issue.
Not answering any questions.
I have a couple about in the wet season, in wet years, doesn't the watershed actually extend up the Kissimmee to Orlando? And then I saw something that was similar about what can be done it says eutrophication from the North Kissimmee Basin. What's the best way to stop this? Does anyone have any thoughts on those, about what's going on north of the lake?
I think even tying that in with identifying local watershed nutrient sources, you know, a lot of the point sources we have a pretty good handle on. That's not to say that we can't reduce them, but we know what they are. It's a lot of the non-point or the more diffuse nutrient sources that are a bigger problem, I think. And that really comes down to, you know, 2 or 3 things that we could start focusing on: fertilizer use. So not only as a home, an HOA, some of the golf courses, so on and so forth, but I think there could be some improvements in terms of using fertilizers. We do have the fertilizer ordinances in place for many of the counties. Septic tanks, so some underperforming septic tanks I think need to be looked at. Of course, that can be expensive, so there's concerns with that. And then tying it into the dog waste, animal waste in general, either from ranching or from just homeowners. And so we need to, I think, do a better job of any kind of waste, nutrient waste, animal waste, removing it from the system and keeping it out of the water. If you can stop the nutrients before they get into the system, it's going to be a lot easier than trying to remove them after the fact.
To tap onto that, I would say that it's sort of two-pronged. One, every single one of us contributes to sources. May not want to admit it, but we do. And so we each have to take sort of a personal assessment and approach that. And that helps us feed into the legislative process, which is finding, after this past water year, the conditions we had and the lack of any real legislative bills that came out to address in a simple way. Like I said, 5 years we've had septic to sewer conversion legislation. It just falls apart. So as we take personal responsibility, then we extend that and we look to our legislatures, because until you have a rule, a standard, an achievable point, people are all going to think somebody else is going to take care of it. And that includes picking up after your pets and everything else that we do. So I just wanted to tap onto that. And then there was a question about the Orlando Kissimmee. So that is the headwater Greater Everglades ecosystem. It's always connected, not just in wet seasons, but there is a 40-foot fall from the top of the watershed down to Lake Okeechobee. So gravity is pulling water down through the Kissimmee. Even if we did nothing, it will come. And then there was something about how do we intercept the Kissimmee or treat Kissimmee watershed. Well, that's what the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Project is about, and you'll hear about that this afternoon. That's Corps and Water Management District CERT project to try to address coming from the Kissimmee. But one of the biggest things that is happening is the district has bought land to expand some of that footprint of the Kissimmee River. Used to be 3 miles wide, the marsh system. Looking at all of these watershed projects and restoring hydrology and slowing the water down, forcing it back through the Kissimmee River restoration, these are all pieces that are building to help us with water quality.
Right. Well, thank you all to our panelists. We have run out of Q&A time, but feel free to stick around and individually. And now we are going to go with a great segue to our next presentation.